If you don't want to leave me alone in this world, follow the channel, because in the next story, I may choose you.
The motion sensor activated at 2:47 in the morning, which Fenris Kale knew because his environmental light system came on at its lowest setting, and his eyes went to the room's time display with the automatic precision of someone who had spent 4 years on a diplomatic hub, learning that the hour of an interruption was usually informative about its nature. 2:47 was not the hour of a maintenance emergency, which tended toward shift changes. It was not the hour of a noise complaint, which tended toward the social hours of whichever delegation was currently observing a late-cycle cultural practice. It was not, as far as his 4 years of experience cataloging the hub's patterns could account for, the hour of anything that had a routine explanation. He processed all of this in approximately 4 seconds, which was the time it took his vision to adjust to the low environmental light and locate the source of the motion sensor's activation. She was standing in the center of his room, not near the door, not at the threshold, not in the tentative position of someone who had entered a space and was uncertain about having entered it. In the center, with the stillness of someone who had moved to a specific position and stopped, which communicated that the position had been chosen and the stopping was deliberate, and that she was waiting for him to process her presence rather than for him to wake up. His eyes completed their adjustment. His professional knowledge completed its assessment approximately half a second later, in the automatic way that 4 years of bioenvironmental specialization produces when it encounters a relevant subject. Vethali, long tapered ears, currently angled in a configuration he did not have a cultural reference for, but that his instincts, trained on 4 years of reading species-specific behavioral literature, were classifying as controlled urgency beneath composed surface. Bioarmor ceremonial grade, the kind worn by members of the Vethali royal line at formal court functions, which he knew because the Vethali delegation's atmospheric profile was on his maintenance roster and because he did his research. The armor was wrong. At its seam points, where the biointegrated panels met the structural framework, there was a faint luminescent reaction, not a feature of the armor's standard operation, which he also knew, and which meant the armor had encountered something it was not designed to encounter, and the reaction was the armor's biological stress response to that encounter. Fenris sat up. He did not reach for anything. He looked at her with the quality of attention he brought to biomaterial problems, which was focused and specific, and did not include alarm as a productive variable. "The seam reaction," he said. "That's a compound interaction." Her ears moved, a small, precise shift that his instincts registered as confirmation. "Yes," she said. Her standard was formal and precise, and carrying something underneath both of those that precision was being used to manage. "I require assistance. The assistance is specific, and I will explain it, but it needs to begin before the compound advances further." She looked at him with eyes that were assessing the available tool against the requirements of the situation. "You are the bioenvironmental technician for this wing," she said. "You know what is on my armor. Can you remove it?" He looked at the seam reaction. He thought about the compounds in the Accord's facility chemical safety database that produced that specific luminescence profile in biointegrated Vethali materials. And the list was short, and the item at the top of it was not an item you found on ceremonial armor by accident. "Dietrich 7, he said, a pause that confirmed it before she spoke. "Yes." He got up. He reached for the emergency kit he kept on the second shelf because 4 years of being responsible for 17 species bioenvironmental safety had produced, in him, the habit of knowing where the relevant tools were before he needed them. "The decontamination suite is 1 level up," he said. "I'll need the equipment there. Can you walk?" "Yes," she said. And then, with the quality of someone who has maintained composure through something that composure was not designed to sustain indefinitely. "Quickly would be preferable." "Then quickly," he said, and moved. The route to the decontamination suite had 3 monitoring points, 2 of which were unstaffed at this hour, and 1 of which had a staffed position at the corridor junction it shared with the delegation residential access. She took the route that avoided the staffed position without being told to, which told him she had mapped it, which told him she had been planning for the possibility of needing this route before tonight, which told him the Tuesday night emergency was not as unplanned as emergencies usually were. He noted this and did not comment on it. The decontamination suite first. The suite was equipped beyond its standard specification. because Fenris had filed the equipment request in his first month. When he had reviewed the Vethali delegation's biomaterial sensitivity profile and determined that the standard decontamination equipment was insufficient for the specific compounds that Vethali's ceremonial bioarmor could interact with under certain conditions. The request had been approved after 3 weeks of administrative processing and had been installed quietly and had never been used until now, which was consistent with the general principle that the most important equipment was the equipment you never expected to need. He assessed the seam reaction under the suite's diagnostic light. The D-7 concentration was significant, not yet at the armor's biological integration layer, which was the layer where the compound stopped being a material problem and became a physiological one, but advancing. He had 40 minutes, maybe 50, before the calculation changed. "I need to understand the configuration," he said. "The seam points and the panel order. The D-7 will have advanced differently depending on where it was introduced." She told him with the precision of someone who had been assessing the problem since before she arrived at his door. The ceremonial toast, the ladle, the second pouring, the specific contact point on the left shoulder panel where the compound had first met the armor. He listened and mapped it and understood from the mapping 2 things simultaneously. First, the removal was going to require the specific improvisational chemistry that his 4 years of research had made him capable of, and that standard decontamination protocols were not designed for. Second, this was not an accident. "The second pouring," he said, beginning the preparation of the neutralizing compound. "In the Vethali ritual order, who receives the second pouring?" She was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation, but was something that lived near hesitation in the space where decisions about trust were made. "The second daughter," she said. He continued the preparation. He did not say what this meant because she already knew what it meant. "Your name," he said, "is not the name on the Vethali delegation roster." "No," she said. "What is your name?" Another moment in the trust-adjacent space. Then, "Thessaly Vorn." He looked up from the preparation. She was looking at him with the quality of someone who has given something that cannot be retrieved and is assessing whether the giving was correct. "I'm Fenris Kale," he said, which she already knew, and which he said anyway because she had given him her actual name and names deserved names in return. "The process is going to take about 90 minutes. The armor's panel configuration means I have to work in sequence. It's not comfortable." "I'm aware. Talk to me while I work," he said, "not because it helps the process. Because 90 minutes of silence while I remove a biological solvent from ceremonial armor is too long, and I'm going to need to understand what happened if I'm going to be useful beyond tonight." She looked at him with the quality of assessment she had been applying since his room, and he felt it arriving at a conclusion. "All right," she said, "then I'll tell you what happened." She talked, he worked. The neutralizing compound required application in a specific sequence that the armor's panel order dictated, each section requiring its own concentration calibration, because the D-7 had advanced differently through different panels, and the neutralization had to match the advancement, or it would drive the compound deeper rather than drawing it out. It was the kind of problem that Fenris found genuinely interesting in the way of problems that required you to know more than the situation had assumed you would know. And he applied to it the quality of focused, specific attention that 4 years of caring about biomaterial chemistry, more than his job classification required, had built in him. She told him about the Vethali court, not the version that the delegation roster presented, the visible structure, the formal roles, the diplomatic configuration that the Accord's information systems contained. The actual one, which was the structure underneath the visible one, where the work that could not be officially attributed was conducted by the people whose roles did not appear in the official documentation. The second daughter's role, the Resource Corridor Treaty, the 3 court factions and their financial positions, the 2 external parties who had interests in the negotiations direction that were significant enough to fund the kind of influence that reached inside a sovereign court's ceremonial preparation room. She delivered this with the precision of someone who has organized a complicated reality for clear transmission, and Fenris received it with the quality of someone who understood that technical briefings required the same organization and were more useful when the person receiving them did not interrupt. 4 days, he said, when she had finished the account of how long she had known the attempt would come. "You had 4 days of knowing, and you didn't tell anyone in the delegation." The two people who knew my negotiating direction are both members of the delegation, she said. So you knew the attempt would come, and you knew who it would come from, and you came to my room. I came to you because the decontamination required specific knowledge that you have, and because you are structurally independent of every political interest that has a position on the treaty negotiation, she said. I came to you because you are the only person in this building who could help me tonight whose help was not already owned by someone with an opinion about what I should do. He applied the neutralizing compound to the fourth panel. The luminescent reaction at the seam point began to fade in the way of a biomaterial interaction reaching its resolution. The facility reports, he said. You read them. A pause, yes. Before tonight. 3 weeks ago, she said, when I mapped the hub's staff structure as part of understanding the environment. And you filed me under resources you might need. Under resources I did not plan to need, but could not afford to not account for, she said, with the distinction of someone for whom the precision of language was a professional necessity. There is a difference. The reports are unusually thorough for my classification level, he said. He was not asking. Yes, she said, that is what made them worth reading. He moved to the fifth panel. The D-Thrix 7 advancement here had been faster. The shoulder configuration had concentrated the compound through the left lateral seam, which he had accounted for in the neutralizing mixture, and which was going to require a longer application time than the previous panels. He adjusted. The adjustment was automatic, the product of knowing the material well enough that the solution arrived before the conscious decision to find it. The ceremonial ladle, he said. For the compound to be in the ladle at the right concentration without triggering the preparation room's standard biohazard sensors, it would need to have been introduced in a carrier, compound that the sensors don't flag. Thessaly was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. The sensors flag D-Thrix 7 at concentrations above 0.3. The carrier suppresses the signature below the flag threshold. The D-Thrix 7 releases from the carrier when it contacts bio-integrated material. The carrier compound, he said. What is it? She told him. He considered this. That carrier is not commercially available. It requires synthesis. The synthesis requires access to the hub's restricted chemical storage. Yes, the restricted chemical storage is accessible to 3 staff classifications, he said, and to the delegation's lead environmental liaisons for their respective atmospheric maintenance requirements. Yes, she said, with the quality of someone who has been following this line of reasoning for 4 days and is now watching someone else arrive at the same destination. The Vethali delegation's lead environmental liaison has access. He finished the 5th panel. He moved to the 6th. The environmental liaison, he said, files atmospheric maintenance requests through the hub's central system. The requests include material specifications. The specifications create a record. Yes, she said. I have access to the central system's material specification records, he said, as the bioenvironmental technician for this wing. The suite was quiet except for the sound of the neutralizing process. The faint, specific sound of a biomaterial compound reaching its resolution, which was not dramatic and was correct. Yes, Thessaly said, and her voice had in it the quality of someone who has been mapping a problem alone for 4 days and has just found, in a conversation in a decontamination suite at 3 in the morning, the component she had been missing. He finished the 6th panel. He began the 7th. Tell me the names, he said, the 2 who knew your negotiating direction. She told him. He filed them. He continued working. The 90 minutes completed itself in the way of work done correctly, not quickly, not slowly, but at the pace the problem required. When the final panel's seam reaction had resolved, and the scanner confirmed that the biointegrated layer was clean, Thessaly Vorn stood in the decontamination suite with ceremonial armor that was doing what ceremonial armor was designed to do, and the expression of someone who has been in an emergency for 4 hours and is now, for the first time, not in the emergency. He looked at the suite's chemical processing logs. They were comprehensive and automatic and filed directly to the hub's central monitoring system, which had a standing information-sharing agreement with the delegations currently in residence. The logs, he said. She followed his gaze. She understood in the way of someone who had been mapping contingencies for 4 days and had not accounted for this one, because this one required knowing that the logs existed and what they filed to and how the filing worked, which was the kind of knowledge that a person had when they had been managing a system for 4 years. and did not have when they had been reading reports about it from outside. "Can you?" she began. "Yes," he said. "But I need you to understand what that means. If I amend the record, I'm inside this. And being inside this means I need to understand it completely, all of it. The two names, the carrier compound, the access records, the treaty negotiations' current status, and what you plan to do with the documentation once we have it." She looked at him with the quality of assessment that had been present since his room, and that was now arriving at a conclusion that was different from its earlier conclusions. Not whether he was adequate for the situation, but whether the situation had produced something she had not planned for.
All
The
right,
amendment
she
took
said.
11 minutes.
Then I'll tell you all of it.
Fenris worked
Yes,
through the
he
hub's
said,
bioenvironmental
you will.
monitoring
He turned to the
system
log
with
terminal.
the specific
Start with the treaty's
practiced
current
fluency of
status
someone who
while
had
I
built
work.
the record structure over 4 years and knew exactly how each log entry's coding determined its classification, its routing, and its visibility to the delegation's information-sharing stream. The D-7 decontamination became a routine biomaterial calibration procedure, a maintenance check on the suite's atmospheric processing systems that had run long due to a sensor recalibration. The coding was correct. The duration matched the logged activity. There was nothing in the amended record that would flag in the automated review that ran every morning. He filed it. He ran the verification. He looked at the completed record with the specific satisfaction of someone who has done a technical thing correctly, and the specific discomfort of someone who has done it for reasons that his facility protocols did not anticipate. "Done," he said. She was beside him at the terminal, reading the amended record with the focused attention of someone confirming that a tool has performed as specified. "It's clean," she said. "The absence of the real record tells the people who placed the D-7 that the attempt failed," he said. "They're going to look for the reason it failed. When they don't find a medical emergency, they're going to look for a decontamination event. When they don't find a flagged decontamination event, they're going to look for an amended record." "Yes," she said, "which narrows the field to people with access to the monitoring system and a reason to amend it. Which narrows it to staff classifications with system access and a connection to the Vethali delegation's bioenvironmental maintenance," he said. "Which narrows it quickly." "How quickly?" "A day," he said. "Maybe 2, if they're not certain enough to move immediately." She was quiet for a moment. That was not concern. It was the quality of someone adding a timeline to a plan and adjusting the plan's sequence accordingly. "Enough time," she said.
For what?
"For the atmospheric signature data," she said. "The carrier compound. You said it's been in the delegation suite's environmental sensors since it was introduced. 6 days minimum based on when the carrier would have needed to be synthesized," he said. "The sensors record everything. The interpretation requires knowing what to look for." "And you know what to look for?" "I've been reading Vethali biomaterial chemistry research for 4 years," he said. "The carrier compound's atmospheric signature is in the literature. I know what it looks like in a sensor record." She looked at him with the quality of assessment completing its revision. "Then we have a day," she said. "Show me what you need and I'll provide the parallel documentation." They worked in the monitoring room through the remainder of the night and into the first hours of the morning, in the way of 2 people solving a problem that requires both of their specific knowledges and cannot be solved by either of them alone. Fenris extracted the atmospheric signature data from the delegation suite's environmental records going back 8 days and ran the signature analysis against the carrier compound's documented profile, which produced a clear record of the compound's introduction, its concentration development, and its movement through the delegation suite's shared spaces. The movement data, matched against the hub's personnel access logs, narrowed the field from 2 to 1 with the specific, impersonal clarity of a technical record that does not have opinions about what it shows. The name it produced was the Vethali delegation's cultural attaché, one of the 2 who had known Thessaly's negotiating direction, whose access logs showed 3 visits to the ceremonial preparation room in the 6 days before the function, and whose atmospheric maintenance requests included a material specification that, when Fenris pulled it from the central system's records and showed it to Thessaly, she looked at for a long moment with the quality of someone confirming something they had suspected and finding the confirmation both useful and costly. "He's been in the court for 11 years, she said. "The record doesn't care," Fenris said, which was not unkind and was accurate. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "Neither does the treaty." The documentation went out through two channels simultaneously, to the hub's administration through Fenris's standard incident reporting protocol, coded as a biohazard material irregularity in the delegation, suite's atmospheric maintenance records requiring administrative review, and to the Vethali sovereign directly through the direct communication protocol that Thessaly's actual role maintained for situations where the delegation could not be the channel, carrying the full documentation package and the signature of an authority that the protocol was designed to recognize. The hub's administration opened the formal inquiry within the hour. The sovereign's response arrived before the inquiry's first session, brief, official, and carrying the specific authority of someone who has received information through a channel designed for emergencies and has acted on it with the speed that the channel exists to enable. The cultural attaché was removed from the delegation that afternoon. The treaty negotiations' next session was scheduled for the following morning. Fenris filed the incident report for the hub's administrative inquiry, which was thorough and accurate, and contained everything that a biohazard material irregularity required to contain and nothing that it did not. He was good at filing reports that were thorough and accurate, and contained exactly what they needed to contain, which was the skill that had made his reports worth reading in the first place. On the Thursday, 2 days after Tuesday, Thessaly came to the bioenvironmental monitoring room at the end of the working day, which was not a time or a location that required her to explain her presence in the way that the decontamination suite at 3 in the morning had required explanation. Because the monitoring room was a facility that delegation members occasionally accessed for atmospheric consultation, and consultation was what it looked like from the outside. From the inside, it looked like Thessaly Vorn sitting in the chair across from Fenris's monitoring station, and telling him that the treaty had been finalized in the direction she had intended, and that the court faction had lost its operative and was currently occupied with the consequences of that loss, and that the Accord's administrative inquiry had been provided with enough of the documentation to conduct a thorough investigation, without the parts that would have required her to explain her actual role, to an inquiry that did not have clearance for her actual role. She thanked him. She did it with the specific, precise quality of gratitude that was not a social instrument, naming what she was grateful for and why it had mattered, in the direct way of someone who understood that the value of honest assessment was not in its comfort, but in its accuracy. He received it with the composure of someone who has been inside something for 2 days and is now, with the something resolved, in the process of determining what the inside of it has produced. "The treaty," he said. "The resource corridor. The direction you finalized it in, is it the right direction?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It's the right direction for the people the corridor affects. It is not the most financially convenient direction for the 3 court factions." "That's usually the shape of a right direction," he said. She was quiet for a moment that had the quality of someone receiving something they had not expected to receive in this conversation. "Usually," she agreed. He looked at the monitoring room's displays. 17 civilizations' atmospheric and biological requirements, recorded and managed and maintained with the thorough specificity of someone who found it genuinely important to get the requirements right. "The Vethali delegation's biomaterial sensitivity profile," he said. "The one on my maintenance roster. It's listed under your travel name." "Yes," she said. "I looked up the travel name when the delegation arrived," he said. "Standard practice. I read the atmospheric requirements and filed the maintenance schedule." He paused. 3 weeks ago, when you were reading the facility reports, you would have seen the maintenance schedule." "I saw it," she said. "The maintenance schedule includes the specific biomaterial compounds I have protocols for," he said. "D-7 is on the list." Her ears moved, the slight forward shift that he had been learning across 2 days of Tuesday nights and Thursday monitoring rooms. "Yes," she said, "it is." "You knew I had the protocol," he said, "before Tuesday." "I knew you had the technical knowledge," she said. "The protocol for D-7 specifically is not standard. It requires the improvised approach. I could not know from the reports whether you would be able to improvise correctly." And you improvised correctly," she said, with the quality of a conclusion that had been reached and was now being delivered as a fact. "In 90 minutes, with compounds you had available rather than compounds specifically prepared, which suggests the improvisation came from understanding rather than from memorized procedure." "Understanding is more useful than procedure in most situations," he said. "Yes," she said, I have found the same thing. She looked at the monitoring displays. The reports you file, the bioenvironmental records, the atmospheric data. They are organized in a way that suggests the person filing them is thinking about what the data means rather than what the format requires. The data means something about the people it describes, he said. The atmospheric requirements aren't specifications. They're what 17 different kinds of beings need to be comfortable in a space that was not built for them. He looked at the displays. Getting that right matters. She was looking at him with the fully forward ears of someone who is not managing their attention and has not been managing it since they sat down. I know, she said. That is what the reports communicated. Most people in your classification do not think about it that way. Most people in my classification are not particularly interested in whether the 17 kinds of beings are actually comfortable, he said. They're interested in whether the readings are within the specified parameters. And you are interested in the beings. I am interested in getting it right, he said, which requires understanding what right means for each of them. He looked at her. The same way understanding your armor required knowing what the D-7 was actually doing to it, not what the standard decontamination manual said about biohazard compounds. She was quiet for a moment that was different from her previous silences. It had the quality of someone who has been known specifically, in the way of their actual work rather than their presented role, and is sitting with the experience of being known that way. Thessaly Vorn, he said, the name you gave me. Yes, she said, not the one on the roster. No, I filed the maintenance schedule under the roster name, he said, 3 weeks ago when the delegation arrived. He paused. I'll need to know which name to use for the follow-up atmospheric consultation, since the documentation needs to be accurate. Her ears rose fully unhurried. The roster name, she said, is for the documentation. And the other one is for the consultation, she said. He looked at the monitoring displays. The hub's bioenvironmental systems continued their patient, thorough work of maintaining 17 civilizations' comfort in a building not built for any of them. The work was not dramatic. It required specific knowledge and genuine interest, and the willingness to understand what right meant rather than what specified meant. And it produced, when done correctly, an environment in which things that did not naturally belong together could exist in the same space without the space itself becoming a problem. The Vethali atmospheric profile, he said, for the follow-up consultation. Some of the biomaterial requirements are more complex than the roster documentation indicates. There are nuances in the chemistry that the standard profile doesn't capture. I know, she said. I read the maintenance schedule. Then you know it's a complicated profile. Yes, she said, it is. Her ears were in the position he had been learning, and the monitoring room held them both in the quality of its specific and slightly too bright light. And the displays showed 17 civilizations' requirements being met with the thoroughness of someone who found it genuinely important to get them right. The consultation will take some time, she said. Most things worth understanding take some time, he said. Yes, she said, they do. Outside the monitoring room, the hub continued its diplomatic business with the patient indifference of a building that had been hosting civilization's machinery for decades, and would host it for decades more, processing the formal and the informal, the recorded and the unrecorded, the names on rosters and the names given in decontamination suites at 3 in the morning. The atmospheric systems processed their readings. The bioenvironmental logs recorded their data. The follow-up consultation was scheduled for the following morning under the roster name with the thorough and specific documentation that the system required. The name in the monitoring room, in the conversation that the system did not record, was the other one. And the consultation, from the quality of the silence that followed the scheduling of it, was going to be considerably more thorough than the documentation would indicate, which was, in the experience of a bioenvironmental technician who had spent 4 years understanding that the most important work was often the work that the specifications did not fully capture, exactly as it should be.